Chapter 16. The Rat Trap. Scrambling out of the sewer, they replaced the manhole cover and snuck out of the back of the Emporium. As they entered base camp, Darkus saw one of the strings of bottle tops was jangling. "It's the rat trap," Bertold said, as Newton flew up to join his cousins on the ceiling. Virginia ran her finger over the map on the wardrobe. "The one by the wall?" Bertold nodded. "What shall we do?" "If it's Humphrey or Pickering, we should leave them in there," Virginia said. "It'll make moving the mountain easier." "It's probably a fox," Darkus said, seeing the frightened look on Bertold's face. "There's only one way to find out," Virginia said, running back out the door and falling to her knees. As they crept towards the rat trap, Bertold whispered, "Surely Humphrey couldn't get into Furniture Forest. He's too big. It must be Pickering." "If it is, let's tie him up and tape over his mouth," Darkus said, thinking about the time he'd spent tied to a chair. Suddenly, Baxter leapt off his shoulder and zoomed forwards. "Shh!" Virginia put her finger to her lips. They could hear a man struggling and cursing. Baxter landed and crawled along the top of the rat trap, flicking his Electra in the air. Virginia silently climbed up onto the top of chest of drawers and peered down into the trap. "Oops!" She clamped her hand over her mouth. "Who is it?" Bertold whispered. "Hello, is someone there?" "It's Uncle Max!" exclaimed Darkus, scrambling up beside Virginia. "Darkus!" Uncle Max peered up at them. "Is that you? Get me out of here!" "Oh gosh, Professor Cuttle, I'm so sorry!" Bertold exclaimed. "How did you get in there?" Darkus asked. "Well, I was trying to find you. Ouch! I need to talk to you about... Ah!" And he sucked in his breath. "Blasted things are biting me." "We'll have you out of there in a second, Professor Cuttle," Virginia said. "Please stop struggling." "Stop struggling? There's a plague of rats in here." Uncle Max looked at Darkus. "I saw you three climb over the wall the other day and thought you might make a den over here, so I came looking for you, which in hindsight was a terrible idea. I've been stuck in here for at least an hour." Darkus jumped down and helped Bertold to move aside a mirrored panel and unlock the gate that had swung shut and trapped Uncle Max. "They're tame rats from a pet shop. You must have frightened them." "I frightened them?" Uncle Max pointed to the dead rats hanging down on strings around his face. "What about these poor chaps?" "Oh, I found them in the basement of our block of flats," Bertold smiled apologetically. "They were already dead from poison, so I put them there to scare an intruder." "Well, they certainly gave me a turn," Uncle Max huffed, crawling out of the cage. "They smell awful." "Oh, I do apologise, Professor Cuttle," Bertold stammered. They weren't meant for you." "Thank heavens!" Uncle Max sat on his knees and smiled at the worried Bertold. "Jolly good trap, though. And quite up to the Egyptian tomb standards, but nonetheless pretty impressive." He looked at the children's guilty faces. "So, is someone going to tell me what's going on here, or do I have to guess?" Virginia nudged Darkus, who was staring at the floor. "Your neck's bleeding." Uncle Max took Darkus by his shoulders. "It's fine. I had a splinter," Darkus replied, covering the cut on his neck with his hand. Would you like to come back to our camp for a cup of tea, Professor Cuttle? Bertold asked politely. It might soothe your nerves, and we can explain everything there. Camp, eh? Uncle Max straightened his safari hat. Don't mind if I do. They set off through the tunnels on their hands and knees, Baxter flying in front, leading the way. This place is a rabbit warren, Uncle Max exclaimed as they inched forward. It's a good job archaeologists are used to confined spaces. I'm sorry, Professor Cuttle, but we do need to be quiet. We don't know when Pickering and Humphrey will get back. Apologies, whispered Uncle Max. Understood. As they all filed through the door of base camp, Uncle Max whistled in amazement at the throbbing glow of fireflies reflected in the chandelier crystals dangling from the ceiling. Wow, this is quite a setup you've got here, he remarked, as Bertold plugged a portable kettle into the car battery. Most of this stuff was already here, Darkus said. Apart from the kettle, Virginia added. That's Bertold's. Uncle Max gazed up at the ceiling in wonder. Where have all these beetles come from? Darkus looked at Virginia but didn't reply. Baxter settled on his shoulder. Uncle Max saw the map on the back of the wardrobe and he wandered over, inspecting the collection of images around the words Lucretia Cutter. He touched the edge of Novak's card. Do you take milk or sugar? Bertold asked. Black. 6 sugars, thank you, Bertold. Uncle Max turned and faced Darkus, his voice suddenly serious. I think you'd better tell me exactly what's going on here, lad. Don't you? Darkus, Virginia and Bertold looked at each other. And no flim-flam, miss, please. Uncle Max took his cup of tea from Bertold and sat down on the sofa. I want the truth. There was an awkward silence in which Uncle Max took a mouthful of tea. I found Dad, Marcus said. Uncle Max sprayed his tea across the table. What? He spluttered. Lucretia Cutter has him in a cell in the basement of her house, Darkus said hurriedly. How can you know that? Uncle Max was on his feet. By Jupiter, please tell me you haven't been there. His face was flushed purple and his eyes were bulging out of their sockets. Darkus looked guiltily at Virginia and Bertold and then nodded. Did she see you? Darkus nodded again, wondering if Uncle Max was about to have a heart attack. She shot at me, but she missed. That's how I got the splinter. She shot at you? Uncle Max paused, then dropped back on the sofa and picked up his tea. Well, that is a relief. What? Bertold spluttered. Why is that good? Because it means she doesn't know who he is, Uncle Max explained. If Lucretia Cutter had recognised Darkus, she wouldn't have shot at him. She'd have kidnapped him and used him against Barty. Uncle Max shook his head. I can't believe you'd be so stupid as to go into that Gorgon's house. You could have got yourself killed, and your father too. What's a Gorgon? Virginia whispered to Bertold. A monster woman who turns men to stone by looking at them, he replied under his breath. Darkus felt like he'd been slapped in the face. When he'd gone to Towering Heights, he hadn't meant to put himself or Dad at risk. How could he, when he didn't even know that Dad was there? Then another thought occurred to him. You knew she had him all along, he gasped. No, at least Not until we went to the museum. And even then, I had no real evidence. Uncle Max shook his head. Her name over the door, that yellow ladybird, and her sudden arrival. These things are not enough to accuse someone of kidnapping. I've been trying to find out where she's keeping him. I thought it might be in one of her cosmetic factories in Wapping. I tried her offices and a string of warehouses on the Thames, but no joy. How? Darkus asked. And when? Well, I haven't been going to work, Uncle Max admitted. And you may not believe this, but I do a rather convincing impersonation of a confused delivery man. He smiled. I've got a blue boiler suit, a badge, and a cardboard box. And I wander into a building looking lost, and I start asking questions. People can be astonishingly helpful, you know. I must admit, it didn't occur to me that she'd have him at her house. The nerve! She must be very confident that she won't get caught. But why didn't you tell me? Darkus asked angrily. Darkus, I didn't have any proof that Lucretia Cutter had Barty. I just had a hunch. I was looking for evidence. Darkus glared at his uncle. But today I thought I should pursue a different line of inquiry. Instead of trying to find out where Lucretia Cutter has Barty, I decided to try and find out why she has him. And that's why I came looking for you. I need to talk to you about your friend, and he pointed at Baxter. I need to know more about your beetles. And he lifted his hands up, gesturing to the fireflies. Darkus wasn't listening. He was so angry his whole body was shaking. You've been keeping secrets from me. No, Darkus, I haven't, Uncle Max said softly. I wanted to be sure of the facts before I told you anything and got your hopes up. Barty is in grave danger. He watched as Darkus struggled with what he was hearing. I'm here now, aren't I? Darkus nodded, his teeth clenched. What about you? Uncle Max raised an eyebrow. Haven't you been keeping a few secrets of your own? Darkus looked at the floor. Well, I didn't tell you the whole truth about how I found Baxter, he admitted. I thought you'd make me give him back. Well, how about you tell me now? Bertolt set about making more tea, while Darkus told his uncle about Baxter falling out of Humphrey's trouser leg, discovering Beetle Mountain, and being kidnapped by his neighbours, and then rescued by the Beetles. Virginia described Darkus taking them to Beetle Mountain and the oath they had sworn to help rescue his father and protect the special insects. Uncle Max sat listening very intently. Oh, if I wasn't seeing this with my own eyes, I'd never believe it, he muttered, looking up at the ceiling and shaking his head. But none of this explains why you went to Lucretia Cutter's house. Well, Lucretia Cutter visited Humphrey and Pickering last week, Virginia explained, on the night they captured and kidnapped Darkus. Novak Cutter saw me looking out the window and dropped the card, Darkus pointed at it. Lucretia Cutter was here, Uncle Max recoiled. Darkus nodded. She's buying the beetles. Over my dead body she is, Max growled. Virginia looked at him surprised. That's why I went to her house, to find out why she wants them, but also, Darkus paused, also to find out whatever it is about her and Dad that you won't tell me. Uncle Max's eyebrows shot up. I see. Now it's your turn to tell the truth, Darkus said, thinking about the photo on Lucretia Cutter's desk. What's this Fabra Project? Uncle Max lifted his safari hat, smoothed down his hair and replaced it, looking at Darkus as if measuring him in somehow. I made a solemn promise to your father when you were born that I would never speak of the Fabra Project to you or anyone else for that matter. And he scratched his chin. But then we never knew we'd find ourselves here, did we? Darkus stared at his uncle. I thought it was you keeping something from me, that you didn't trust me. He turned away. But all along, Dad's been the one keeping secrets. Your dad trusts you, lad, Uncle Max said. It's just that, well, there are some things that the young shouldn't be burdened with. When Dad disappeared, people said terrible things about him. Darkus' voice was flat and unemotional, but I kept his face here. He tapped a finger between his eyes. Each time someone said that he'd run away or that he'd killed himself, I knew they were wrong. Because my dad would never do that. My dad isn't like that. And he looked up at his uncle, his vision blurred by tears. But I don't know what my dad is really like, do I? I don't know him at all. Nonsense. Look at me, lad. Uncle Max took Darkus's hand. You know your father better than anyone. But before he was your dad, he was a young man with ambition and without the responsibility of a family. Now that young man was like you in many ways, and he was a great adventurer. That's something you should be proud to learn. An adventurer like you? No. I search for secrets, dig for truths, and if I'm lucky, I find an interesting story or a valuable object. Uncle Max sighed. Now, your father's adventures were far greater than any of mine, and more dangerous. His adventures were in thought. He explored the very fabric of nature. He experimented with possibility, and all within the confines of his own head. You can only do that sort of thing if you have a brilliant mind, and he does. Mine's rather ordinary by comparison. Your father, Darkus, is the kind of person who changes history. That doesn't sound like Dad, Darkus frowned. His father was gentle and he liked staring out of windows. He would never describe him as an adventurer. Well, that's because he stopped his adventures when you came along. But why? Well, adventures are dangerous, Darkus, and villains are real. Uncle Max seemed to grow older as he spoke. Ideas are powerful, and there are people who exploit even the most charitable idea for power or money. The greedy stop at nothing to satisfy their appetites, with no thought to the devastation or destruction it causes. He sounded a bit angry. That's not a world in which your father wanted to raise a family. Dad gave it up to have me. In a manner of speaking, Uncle Max rested his chin on his hands. Barty was an entomologist, a genius with arthropods. He specialised in coleoptera. Beetles were his passion. And because of his great skill in observing and understand insects, Professor Appleyard invited him to be one of the esteemed scientists working on the Fabra Project. An entomologist? Uncle Max nodded. The Fabra Project had a bold remit to see if it was possible to reverse the damage humans had done to the planet by harnessing the power of insects. The power of insects? Bertold whispered in awe. Is that possible? The sad fact is that the number of insects is in decline. As we destroy their habitats, so we destroy their species. But we desperately need them. If all the mammals on the planet were to die out, the planet would flourish. But if all the insects disappeared, everything would very soon be dead. Led by Professor Appleyard, the Fabra Project explored the possibility of setting up global insect farms to breed species of insect that would boost pollination, naturally control pests, cutting down the use of pesticides, and provide humans with food and deal with human and animal waste. Ha! The dung division, Virginia sniggered. Esme was part of that team. That's how your father met her. Mum was a scientist. Darkus was flabbergasted. She was a damn fine ecologist, Uncle Max said. He shook his head with a sad smile. Your father was working with a geneticist to see what could be achieved by tampering with the genetic makeup of beetles. Lucretia Cutter, Darkus spat. Oh, she was plain old Dr. Lucy Johnson back then. An odd girl, if I'm honest, but very clever and fiercely ambitious. She and Barty had a major breakthrough with that transgenic experiments on certain type of beetles. Transgenic? Virginia frowned. What does that mean? It means changing the genetic structure of an organism by adding genes from another organism. They took genes from mice and successfully added them to the genes of a beetle. A beetle mouse! Virginia laughed. I don't get it. What's so amazing about a beetle mouse? The first transgenic experiments used genes from mice. Uncle Max paused for an uncomfortably long time. But the aim, the true aim, was to find a transgenic process that would successfully transfer human genes into beetles, producing a new species of beetles capable of intelligent thought to work collaboratively with humans and clean up the environment. Ooh, beetles with a human gene? Darkus looked at Baxter perched on his shoulder. Did they do it? Virginia sat up, staring at Newton, bobbing around Bertold's head. Did they discover the trans-thingy process? Uncle Max sighed, looking at Baxter. I've seen a beetle behave like Baxter before, when your father was still working on the Fabra Project, and it was carrying his genes. Beetles are transgenic. Bertold looked up at Newton, smiling in wonder. Darkus studied Baxter. Was Dad's beetle a rhinoceros beetle too? It was a Goliath beetle, and he was a majestic beast. Darkus thought about the zebra-striped beetle he'd met on Beetle Mountain. What happened to it? Barty had Goliath frozen and donated him to the Natural History Museum's collection for future research. Darkus blinked. He was certain if they looked that they would find Dad's beetle gone. What happened to the Fabra Project? Virginia asked. Well, when they started having successful results, Lucy tried to persuade Barty to leave the project and set up their own laboratory. She believed their work would make them rich. She didn't want to help the planet, Bertold asked, dismayed. But she got loads of money, Virginia said. Yes, she has now, Uncle Max agreed. Dad refused, Darkus said with certainty. Uncle Max nodded. Realising what her motives were, Barty destroyed all their research and handed his resignation to Professor Appleyard, explaining what Lucy was planning. Outraged and furious, Lucy Johnson disappeared, emerging several years later under a new name, Lucretia Cutter. Without the genetics work, the Fabra Project floundered and it was closed down. Darkus's dad destroyed his research, Bertold said. But he didn't, did he, Uncle Max? Darkus stared at his uncle. It's upstairs in your flat. He remembered what he's seen, where he's seen the words Fabra Project. The box that ripped open with Nefertiti's teeth in it. It was full of folders that said Fabra Project on the side of it. Uncle Max looked grey. I didn't want to take it. I'm not a fan of mucking about with nature. I'm a man of the old world, and I didn't approve of what your father was doing. I felt he was opening a Pandora's box. In fact, we almost fell out about it. Barty promised your mother he'd burn the research, but he couldn't bring himself to do it and destroy his life's work. So I agreed to keep it on the condition that he'd never meddle with it again. It's been sitting in my box room for years. I've forgotten it was there until you came to stay. Lucretia Cutter said the beetles belonged to her, Virginia said. Uncle Max frowned. It was only a matter of time before she found a way to complete the human beetle transgenic process on her own. This is serious, isn't it? Darkus said. Very, Uncle Max replied gravely. Beetles are the single most successful species of creature on this planet. They can adapt to almost any environment. The question your father was trying to answer was what happens if you genetically enhance the most adaptable creature on the planet. I thought that was the most dangerous question I'd ever heard. But Lucretia Cutter also said that she wasn't ready yet, Darkus said, remembering what she said in the room in the two-way mirror. And she said she wouldn't let anyone stop her. Not them, not him, nobody. I think Dad was trying to stop her. I've been trying to find out what she's up to, but every avenue I've explored turns up a blank. It's impossible to investigate her. No one will speak about her. They're all petrified. Uncle Max shook his head. However, I am certain of one thing. Whatever she's up to, we have to do everything in our power to stop her. We've got to tell the police, Bertold said. The police are astonishingly uninterested in investigating any of the leaves I provided them with. But why? Bertold asked. Because someone is exerting their power and making sure that Barty's disappearance is not looked into. Lucretia Cutter, Virginia snarled. And if she thought that we knew where Barty was, she'd move him immediately and we'd never find him, Uncle Max said. So we have to tread very carefully. We can't trust anyone but each other. Darkus looked at Virginia and Bertold. We have a plan to rescue Dad. Really? Uncle Max smiled. I hope you might. Care to share it with me? Baxter rose up from his perch on Darkus's shoulder and hovered beside the boy's face, his elytra lifting high, his soft wings vibrating like a hummingbird's. "We'd love to," said Darkus. "But first, I need to go home and get 2 bottles of champagne," Bertolt said, climbing to his feet. Darkus smiled at his uncle's surprised expression. "It's all part of the plan."